We're still in the scheme of redemption. And last week we were talking about Jacob, and in the whole scheme of redemption, just to really center us on what the focus is versus what I've been talking about. The focus is that through Abraham is going to be the seed that was promised in Genesis 3:15. And so we talked about Abraham at some good length, and now we're talking about Isaac and Jacob, and we're going to talk about Judah a little bit after Jacob, because Genesis really sets you up for the entire Bible. I mean, it really does. And there's this pattern that repeats over and over. But a lot of the details about the people that we get are all centered around God's scheme to release mankind from the bondage of sin. There's a lot of details in the story that we get that, that's important, but it's not an exhaustive history of the nation of Israel. It's the history that pertains to the promises that God made to different people. The things that he said to Eve, the things that he said about mankind, and then he says to Abraham, and it passes on to these people. And last week we were talking about Jacob, and I think I misspoke. Somebody corrected me, and I really appreciate this. I think I said that Jacob fell asleep, and we don't have it written anywhere that he fell asleep before he wrestled with the man until daybreak. So thank you for correcting me. We don't have it recorded that happened, that he fell asleep, because it wasn't a dream. We talked about how he was limping on that hip. So we're in Genesis 33. And Jacob has just this wonderful encounter with Esau. And we don't have the time exactly to go through this like I would like to, but the encounter that Jacob has with Esau in just sort of, I don't even know the right way to say this, reconciling with each other and meeting up with each other, it is so similar to the parable of the prodigal son that it doesn't seem like an accident. It is amazing. And so I encourage you, if you get some time, to think about that. And so this whole encounter, Jacob reconciles with Esau. Jacob settles in Shechem. And in Genesis 33, look at verse 20, please. Genesis 33, look at verse 20. We talked about how Jacob, the name Jacob, means one who snatches the heel, or someone who's a deceiver, trips people up. And that's been his character throughout most of what we've seen. But there's been a big shift here lately. And in Genesis 33, verse 20, after all of these things happen and he reconciles with Esau, verse 20, he erected there an altar and called it El Elohe Israel, which means the God of Israel. So here, Jacob, who has been renamed by the man who wrestled with him, we talked about that last week, his name is Israel. And now, after all of these things, he gets to verse 20 and he says, the God of Israel. He's saying, this is my God. Compare that to what he said when he was in Bethel. He said, if everything goes well with me, if all these things happen and I return back to my father's home safely, then he'll be my God. And now we see Jacob, whose new name is Israel. He has just claimed God as his God. That's a really big deal. Okay, any thoughts? That's kind of like a recap plus one little new piece of information from what we did last week. Any thoughts or comments leading up to where we are now from what we talked about last week into this morning? Okay. Is it cold enough for anybody, by the way? I mean, it's cold today. I usually don't wear a jacket for this. It's cold. Okay. Well, let's keep on going here, because Jacob, look at chapter 35, Jacob is going to return to Bethel. And again, it's so important that we remember this is where God gave him, Jacob, the covenant promises. And he said that the promise that I made to Abraham will go through you if you do all these things and do what I tell you. And Jacob kind of responds with that. It's not really an ultimatum, but he's saying, if all these things go well with me, if I return to my father's house, then you'll be my God, and then I'll serve you. And in Genesis 35, let's read verses 1 through 8, please. 1 through 8. God said to Jacob, arise, go up to Bethel and live there and make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods which are among you and purify yourselves and change your garments. Let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress and has been with me wherever I have gone. What a wonderful thing to say. Verse 4, so they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods which they had and the rings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak which was near Shechem. As they journeyed, there was a great terror upon the cities which were around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. So Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, and he and all the people who were with him. He built an altar there and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. Now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died and was buried below Bethel under the oak, and it was named Allon Bacuth. So, I mean, this is really we see his name's Israel. He's been changed his name to Israel, but they've been calling him Jacob here. And God says, go back to Bethel, go back to that place where I revealed myself to you and told you all these things. And we don't see any, I don't even know, second guesses. We don't see any like, I don't know, God, I don't know if I want to do that. He just goes. He goes. And not only that, but him and everybody with him in verse 2, he tells all those people, put away the foreign gods that are among you, purify yourself and change your garments. We've just seen where Israel has called God his God, and he's telling them, okay, God told me to go to Bethel, put away all your foreign gods. We're going to do this. Go build an altar to God, and this is the way that it's going to be. And so now it really seems like this Jacob, who's been the deceiver, who's been tripping people up, who's had all of these problems and all these issues, he's done with that. He's got this new name, and now God is his God. And so it seems like he's responding to the grace and the mercy and the good things that God has been doing for him with the kind of faith that God has always required from his people. And that's what we see him doing. Okay, any thoughts or anything so far? Sir? We'll go here, then here. Hmm. What was the question? How does that rub with each other to make sense? Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the foreknowledge of God for sure, because we see even when we're going to notice this when the law is given, there's a whole section on how kings of Israel are supposed to compose themselves and how they're supposed to behave. There's no king at that point. I was like, why would he give those instructions? He knew what was going to happen. And then also the seed promise, that's going to be a king too, but maybe not in the way that they anticipated. Does that help? Yeah, for sure. And I'm really glad that you noticed that he mentioned there's going to be kings that come from his line, because we're going to talk about Jacob's line. We've been tracking the seed promise throughout these lines, but then we're also going to notice, I think today, if it's not today, it's going to be next week, Lord willing, about somebody else's line that is explicitly detailed for us. I think it's in chapter 36. And that line is also going to have kings in it and chiefs and people who are wealthy and have power, but it's very different from what God promises when he promises kings and power and authority. And so when we get there, I hope I'll remember to acknowledge it. And if I don't, flag me down. That'll be all right. Okay. Serge, you have something? Why he hid him under a tree? Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Why he would hide them under a tree rather than destroy them? I really don't know. The purpose seems to be the same regardless, and get them out of your presence and turn to the true God. Okay, any other thoughts on what we've gotten to so far? Okay, well, speaking of turning to God, when you turn to God, God has something to say about that usually. So in Genesis 35, look at verse 9, please. We're going to read verses 9 through 12. And again, just be tracking these promises that were made to Abraham that just continue to come back and increase here. Look at verse 9. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram, and he blessed him. God said to him, your name is Jacob. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. Then he called him Israel. God also said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. Before we even go, be fruitful and multiply. When you see that phrase, what does that make you think of? Creation. It makes you think of the garden. So these promises that God is making to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, these are not just, okay, everything got messed up and now we've got to start over with something completely different. This is what we talked about. This is probably 5 weeks ago at this point, but all along the way, The point is to get back to the garden, to that perfect relationship, perfect fellowship, perfect place with God. Okay, anyway, be fruitful and multiply. That's something that should lights and sirens in our head. That's creation. That's God's original design and what he wants. But then let's keep going. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come forth from you. There's that again. The land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give it to you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering on it. He also poured oil on it. So Jacob named the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. And that's such an important place in Jacob's life. But he repeats these promises to him, just letting him know again that this is going to come through your descendants after you. And the seed promise that had been made to Abraham is going to be through Jacob. And so Jacob sets up this pillar. He pours out a drink offering on it and oil, which is so different than the first time he's at Bethel. Because the first time he's at Bethel is when he does that. If you're going to be with me, if I return back to my father's home safely, if all these things go well and you protect me, then you'll be my God. And now God speaks to him and says, here's my promises, and he worships him. He sets up this pillar, he pours oil on it, does this drink offering, and there's no question here from Jacob. So it's such an important place in his life. And he's true to his word because he makes an oath almost. He takes a vow almost back. He says, if I return to this place, then you'll be my God. And here he shows that that's exactly what's happening. So speaking of the garden, because we mentioned that, this is sort of the pattern that we see through Genesis. Okay, God has told what his covenant promises are going to be. And now Jacob, Israel here, is responding to God's grace in faith, the way that God has always wanted from the beginning. So the question is sort of here, have we made it back to the garden then? I mean, this is great. God is repeating his covenant and Jacob's responding in faith. So have we made it back to the garden? Can man dwell with God in harmony now? Well, not quite. And this is where we're going to get to Genesis 36. This is sort of, look at Genesis 36, verse 1. These are the records of the generation of Esau, that is Edom. Okay, so, I mean, just given what we've just read, and then what happens in verses 16 through 28, they start going through the generations, and certain people die, and things like that happen. Doesn't it seem like a really weird spot for Genesis 36? For the generations of Esau? I don't know, am I the only one that thinks that that's a really weird spot to put that? You would think that you would have this, I don't know, maybe at the end of, at the end of chapter 33 when Esau was last mentioned. But we don't get it right after chapter 33. We've gone away from Esau for a couple chapters now. And then we get the generations of Esau. Why do you think that is? Well, I have a theory. I'll tell you what my theory is that we've seen this in Genesis multiple times. God's covenant is repeated to the person that he is telling his covenant to. That person responds in faith, but then the readers here need to be reminded that these people are not the solution. They need redemption just like anybody else. Because as we go through Genesis 36, this is where the lineage of Esau is sort of given here, and it looks a lot like the lineage of Cain from chapter 4. Do you remember about that, chapter 4? The lineage of Cain, there was no mention of God in that. You didn't see anything like that, and I think it's intentional, just like that. In Genesis 26, verses 34 and 35, it told us that Esau had married the daughter of the Canaanites because it had brought grief to his parents. He knew good and well what he was doing when he married these women. And he shouldn't have done that, but his descendants proved to live similarly. If you just scan through Genesis 36 and notice some of the titles that are here for some of these descendants of Esau, you're going to see chiefs, you're going to see kings, you're going to see people in power, you're going to see people who have great wealth, but not once will you see a mention of devotion to God. You won't see once any inclination that they were even thinking about God. And it seems like right after we get these promises to Jacob, he responds in faith. The reader needs to be reminded, okay, this isn't the garden yet, because the problem of sin, the problem of Genesis 3, chapter 3, verse 6, is still alive and well in the world. And so the need for the seed, the need for the Redeemer is just as prevalent as it was from Genesis 3:6, which is the first sin, until all sin is completely eradicated always forever. Okay. Any thoughts or anything so far on that? I got a little bit more to say on Esau.
Confirmation of what had been said to Rebekah when the boys were born, that two nations are going to come from you. And now we have these two nations being outlined. You know, the older is going to serve the younger. So now we know who the players are in this in terms of Esau's family and how this is about to play out as we go on forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we're talking about the Edomites. We're talking about Edom. And so, perfect segue into what we want to talk about next. Think about Edom throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Good or bad? Bad. And not just a little bad, but like really bad. And just think about this. Malachi, we're going to turn to Malachi in just a second. But think about this. Malachi, Obadiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Amos. 6 of the prophets have entire sections devoted to Edom. And do you think they're good, fuzzy, happy butterflies? Not a chance. And it's because they were so wicked and so evil. And we see that in Genesis 36, that the line of Esau is sort of just like Cain, where it's kind of like the type of sinful behavior. And let's turn over to Malachi 1, because I want for us to see this. Malachi 1. And in Malachi 1, we're going to read the first 5 verses, because Edom really does become sort of the type for sinful behavior and sinful attitudes. And in Malachi 1, let's read the first 5 verses. They had come to represent a certain ethos. Is that the right way to say that? Ethos? They had come to represent a certain type of person. So in Malachi 1, let's read the first 5 verses here. The oracle of the word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. I have loved you, says the Lord, but you say, how have you loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, declares the Lord? Yet I have loved Jacob, but I have, what does it say in verse 3? I have hated Esau, and I have made his mountains a desolation and appointed his inheritance for the jackals of the wilderness. Though Edom says, we've been beaten down, but we will return and build up the ruins, thus says the Lord of hosts, they may build, but I will tear down, and men will call them the wicked territory and the people toward whom the Lord is indignant forever. Your eyes will see this, and you will say, the Lord be magnified beyond the border of Israel. So, I mean, again, we're not talking about warm, fuzzy feelings for the Edomites at all here. Edom had come to represent, I mean, this godless, prideful people who had a disdain for God. The whole book of Obadiah is about, you know, here's the Edomites who live in the rocks and in the mountains, and Jerusalem and Judah is being destroyed. And these people are, by their descendants, they're related distantly at this point, and they're laughing at them, and they're taking their spoil, they're taking their plunder. And God's like, that's not going to fly. And so God judges them for it. In 6 of the prophets, 6 of them, the line of Esau is wicked and evil. Right after we see God's covenant being repeated to Jacob, Jacob responds in faith. We need to be reminded as a reader of Genesis that the problem of sin is not solved. Just because God is doing what he's doing and working, that the solution it's not there yet. And but that's what is going to come. So right on the heels of Jacob, oh, that's funny. So I didn't mean to do that. Right on the heels of Jacob, one who snatches the heel. Okay, right on the heels of Jacob, Israel responding in faith, the whole chapter of Genesis 36 reminds us that the world and the problem of sin is still prevalent, and the need for a savior is still prevalent. Even though the covenant's been repeated to Jacob, to Israel, the problem of sin is still needed. The need for that Redeemer from Genesis 3:15 that was passed to Abraham, Genesis 22 or Genesis 12, to Isaac, Genesis 26, now in Israel, is still needed. Okay, any thoughts on that so far? Okay. All right, great. So Genesis 37 through 50. Genesis 37 through 50. It centers mainly on the life of Joseph. And Joseph is so prominent because it's through Joseph that God carries out the transition from Canaan to Egypt to preserve the seed of Abraham and build up the numbers so that they can achieve that status as a nation. In Genesis 12, God made those promises. You know, you've got the nation, the land, and the seed promises. And so Joseph, this is so fascinating to me because so much time in Genesis is spent on Joseph when the reality is the seed is not even passed through Joseph. But so much of Genesis is devoted to Joseph because it's through Joseph that God brings about the promise of a nation. And what's crazy too is back in Genesis 15, if you want to look back at that just for a moment, please. God is repeating the promises to Abraham in Genesis 15. And we noticed this when we went through it, but he gives him a very detailed explanation of what's going to happen to his descendants after him. And Joseph is the one that sort of makes this come about, God through Joseph. And Genesis 15, verses 13 through 16, Genesis 15, 13 through 16, God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. I mean, he's telling this but way before this ever happens. Verse 14, but I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Look at verse 16. Then in the fourth generation, they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. I mean, God told Abraham, I know exactly what's going to happen. This is exactly the way it's going to work. In the fourth generation, they're going to come back. So that's amazing. Just in and of itself, that's amazing to me. But Genesis 37 through 50 focuses so much on Joseph because the thing that God already told Abraham was going to happen, that's sort of how it comes about. But again, the seed doesn't go through Joseph. The seed goes through Judah. It doesn't go through Joseph. So it's just interesting to me that so much time is spent on Joseph when the seed doesn't go through him. It goes through Judah. But that seed couldn't be preserved if it weren't for Joseph. I love that. It's really cool. Okay, any thoughts before we really get into it? So I just said a lot right there. Joseph was a person of faith? Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to look at some stuff about that after we're done talking about him. Yeah. Any other thoughts? And I'm so glad you said that. That's so important because we've been noticing from Genesis 1 to where we are now that God's grace has been poured out on people since before the beginning of time. And his requirement is that they respond to him in faith. And he's always required that, and he still requires that. So that's such a great point to bring up. Okay, anything else? Okay. Well, let's see. Okay, so the reason why the line of the seed that is coming from Israel that has been passed through Abraham and Isaac and is going to pass through Israel, why is it not the firstborn, the secondborn, or even the thirdborn that get to pass on this seed, that get that birthright? I mean, just sort of like a quick review of the book of Genesis. Why is it that Reuben, Simeon, and Levi don't get to pass on that seed? They don't get the birthright. They all failed their father. Did you word it that way on purpose? I guess that's a sermon if I've ever heard one. Yeah, they all failed their father for sure. And so with Reuben, it was he slept with one of his father's concubines, Bilhah, on their bed and defiled it. And so he gave up his birthright right there. Simeon and Levi, we skipped over this, but actually in, let's see, chapter 34, Dinah, who's the daughter of Jacob, has 12 sons through all these. I mean, it's like birth wars. It could be a TV show almost. And then they have a daughter, and there's Shechem, the Shechemites. They rape her. They take her, and the prince there rapes her. And so Simeon and Levi are just absolutely enraged at this, as any logical, reasoning person would be. But then what they do is wrong. They say, okay, if all of your men in the city circumcise themselves, then you can marry Dinah, which is her name. You can marry her. And while they're in their pain first of all, they listened and they were willing to do that, which says a lot. I mean, it's terrible that they raped her because they should not have done that. But then he loved her and was willing to have all the males circumcise themselves. And while they're in their pain, Simeon and Levi go in there and brutally slaughter them. Just brutally slaughter them. And Jacob says, the thing you have done is not good. You have brought shame on me, and you shouldn't have done that. So they give up the birthright. So now the birthright falls to number 4, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. And so now the birthright falls to Judah. And we'll talk about it more when we get there. It's fallen to Judah. Look at, let's see. I got so many things I'd like to talk about. I don't know which ones we can get to today. Um, just thinking about the story of Joseph. So Joseph is he's the favorite one. He has this, it's either a multicolored tunic or it's a longer one or it's got long sleeves. You can read for hours about what people argue what this tunic was that he had that was different. But he was obviously the favorite. He has these dreams that his brothers are going to bow down to him and his parents are going to bow down to him. And they don't like that. They don't like it one bit. And his brothers are doing some stuff that they probably shouldn't do. Joseph goes out there. What do they do to him? They throw him in a hole and they're like, let's kill him. We're going to kill him. But Judah, the guy that we should think about his name, Judah is like, well, let's not kill him because we could sell him and make some money. I mean, that's what we really need to do. I mean, okay, this is the guy who the seed promise from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob is going to pass through, and he is going to sell his brother to make some profit and get him out of their hair, which is, I mean, that's crazy, but this is the guy that we're talking about. And then, okay, Joseph goes to Egypt. I'm sure a lot of us know a lot about Joseph going to Egypt. Conley preached a lesson a couple of months ago about it. It was great. God blesses him unbelievably. And what happens? They end up bowing down to Joseph, exactly like what those dreams said would happen. And again, the reason, well, a couple of reasons, but one of the biggest reasons why Joseph is focused on in Genesis 37 through 50 is because the nation promise is going to be fulfilled, and it could only be fulfilled in this way. And he's a person of faith. But again, the line, the seed, because we're talking about the scheme of redemption, the seed is actually going to go through Judah. So I think I want to spend a little bit of time on Judah here. And let me see where I want to go with this. And maybe we'll come back to Joseph in just a minute. Okay, let's go to Genesis 38, please. Genesis 38. There's, I mean, there's so much we could talk about just about Judah alone here. Judah marries a Canaanite woman. We see that in 38. Look at verse 2. Genesis 38, verse 2. Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Then she conceived again and bore a son and named him Onan. She still bore another son and named him Shelah, and it was at Chezib that she bore him. And Judah, verse 6, took a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord took his life. Then Judah said to Onan, go to your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her, and raise up offspring for your brother. Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order to not give offspring to his brother. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers. So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. So, I mean, we see some problems right away with Judah and with Judah's family. Judah goes and marries a Canaanite woman, which we don't really see that that's looked on favorably in Genesis so far, right? So far, we see people traveling to go marry people who are of the same family, who are of their people. And they're like, don't let my son, Rebecca said about Jacob, don't let my son marry one of these women here because I don't remember exactly how she says it, but basically like they ain't it. And so when Esau does that, it's highly displeasing. They send Jacob away, and we just see this stuff happen all the time. Happened with Isaac as well and Rebecca. And so here Judah just takes a wife from the Canaanites. That seems like not a great thing. And later on, we're going to know that's definitely not a great thing. And something's going on with Judah and the way that he parents, or the way that his sons make decisions and stuff like that, because we see that Judah's firstborn, verse 7, was evil in the sight of the Lord, so the Lord took his life. I mean, that's got to be bad. We don't know all the details, but he was evil, Judah, and the Lord took his life. And so Judah tells Onan, do your, I guess this is sort of kinsman redeemer stuff, have children with your brother's wife so that she may have children, but they're not going to be yours. And so Onan, he doesn't do it the way that he should, and he emits on the ground, and this is highly displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so God kills him too. So Judah's descendants, like, think about this, the seed that's going to come from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is going to pass through Judah, and so far Judah's seed, his descendants, they ain't it. God's taken them. And they have a third son, and so Judah's like, okay, you, Tamar, remain or not a virgin, but remain a widow in your father's house until my son grows up, and then he can fulfill this duty that Onan didn't do. And that's where we're going to just see some more really weird stuff happen. And there's stuff in the Bible that is weird. And sometimes whenever I'm talking to people and they're like, well, I've never read the Bible. I was like, well, let's look at it because this is real life stuff that actually happens. This stuff is crazy. So look at Genesis 38 and let's see what happens here. I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with this. Time goes by, Judah's wife dies, and we see that Judah goes up to Timnah in verse 12. And let's see, somebody told Tamar, verse 13, behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she removed her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil and wrapped herself and sat in the gateway of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah had grown up and she had not been given to him as a wife. So the problem here is Judah said, when my youngest son gets older, then you will be given to him. And that way, all the people that were supposed to have children with you, now that will be fulfilled. But some time's gone by. We saw that in verse 12, after a considerable time, and she still hasn't been given as a wife. So here we are going to see Tamar takes things into her own hands. And verse 15, when Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, here now, let me come into you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, what will you give me that you may come into me? So, this is weird all the way around. Here is Tamar, who is his daughter-in-law, has been with two of his sons, and he promised his third son to her. She, after a considerable time, is like, okay, what should have happened is not happening. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to take this into my own hands. But Judah thinks that she's a harlot, which, what would you expect the one through whom the seed is going to come from when he's walking by the way and sees a harlot? And keep walking. That's what you would expect, right? But that's not what he does. He turned to her by the road and said, here now, let me come into you. That's Judah. That's what he was going to do. And she was like, what are you going to give me that you may come into me? She covered her face. He didn't know that this was her. Look at verse 17. He said, therefore, I will send you a young goat from the flock. She said, moreover, will you give me a pledge until you send it? Verse 18, he said, what pledge shall I give you? And she said, your seal and your cord and your staff that's in your hand. So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and departed and removed her veil and put on her widow's garment. So they kind of haggle, seems like, over what the price is going to be for this sexual intercourse they're going to have. Okay, it's going to be a young goat for my flock and I'll send it to you. And she's like, okay, how do I know that you're actually going to pay me whenever all is said and done? How do I know I'm going to get this payment? Gives a ring, staff. Well, there was a third thing. I don't remember what it was. Your seal, your cord, and your staff that's in your hand. So here's this obvious proof, this stuff that if she lets people know who this is and who she's got, shame's going to come to him. And so he better send that young goat as payment. And that's what happens here. So let's keep reading here. Verse 20. When Judah sent the young goat by his friend, I wonder why he sent by his friend. I just wonder that sometimes. The Adulamite, to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. He asked the men of her place, saying, where's the temple prostitute who was by the road at Enaim? The temple prostitute. So now we get even more details into where Judah's head was. He was like, this is a temple prostitute. That's not in the service of the Lord, because God never, ever once condones that. Never wants that, ever. So this is some false god that he thinks that this woman is a harlot, a temple prostitute, in the service of false gods. That's Judah, who the seed is going to come from. This just is not what we would expect at all. Okay, but they said, there has been no temple prostitute here. So he returned to Judah and said, I did not find her. And furthermore, the men of the place said, there has been no temple prostitute here. So Judah said, let her keep them. Otherwise, we will become a laughingstock. After all, I sent this young goat, but you did not find her. So he's like, okay, she can keep it. Don't let the word get out, or we're going to become a laughingstock. Let her keep it. So let's keep reading, because she's pregnant. We read that she's pregnant with her father-in-law's child. All right, verse 24. It was about 3 months later that Judah was informed, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry. Then Judah, look at the end of verse 24. Then Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. Okay, I didn't mean for that noise to happen, but that was perfectly timed noise. I mean, Tamar's pregnant. He has promised his youngest son to her to be her husband, his wife. After a considerable time, he doesn't follow through with what he said he was going to do. And now Tamar's pregnant. And it seems like she's done this by harlotry, which I guess she has. It's weird. This is a weird situation. And okay, this woman is pregnant by harlotry. Bring her out and let her be burned. There's a thing called cognitive dissonance. I'm sure that you've heard of it. Cognitive dissonance, where you say that you believe and do one thing when in reality you've said and done another thing. It's sort of like blocking out the things you don't want to think about so that you still look good in your mind. And that seems to be what Judah is dealing with here, because it's 3 months later. It's not like he forgot. 3 months later, bring her out and let her be burned. Look at verse 25. It was while she was being brought out. She was being brought out for what? To be burned, to be punished, to be killed. While she was being brought out, that she sent to her father-in-law saying, I am with child by the man to whom these things belong. She said, please examine and see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these. Verse 26, Judah recognized them. I think that's such an understatement. Judah recognized them and said, what does Judah say in verse 26? She is more righteous than I. She is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not have relations with her again. So here is Judah, who the seed is going to come through. We're talking about Jesus, that Jesus is going to come through Judah. This is a whole set of circumstances that we would not imagine that Jesus would come through this line at all, right? I mean, am I the only one that thinks that? This is not what I would expect at all. And yet he says, this woman is more righteous than I. He was wrong, which is very different than we see, especially from his sons earlier in the chapter, especially with Onan. He was supposed to be that kinsman redeemer. He was supposed to continue the line from his dead brother, but he made a decision not to do that. And then Judah realizes, you know what, I am wrong, and she is more righteous than I. And so there were twins in her womb, and Perez and Zerah are their names, Perez and Zerah. And so we're going to see that through Perez, by Judah and Tamar, the seed of Genesis 3:15 that is promised to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and is going to go through Judah. It's through this that the Christ comes. And that's just not what we would expect. I don't know. That's not what I would expect at all. But I think that God is just showing us that it is a very vivid picture that Judah is not the solution to the problem of sin. The one who's the solution to the problem of sin is coming from his line, but it's not Judah. He needs redemption just like anybody else. And God can use imperfect vessels for his perfect plan. God's plan doesn't need perfect people because his plan is already perfect in and of itself. Judah and Tamar needed redemption just like any other human, and that redemption comes through their seed. Yes, sir? Yeah. 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 Oh, I love that. Oh, yeah, those are both great points for sure. Anybody else? Any other thoughts on this?
Like this, we sort of have the things about them that upset us, but you kind of got to pay attention to what the people in the story are upset about, because they seem to have a different perspective. And he doesn't say she's more righteous than me because I slept with a hooker. He doesn't even say she's more righteous than me because I've been with a woman who was promised to my son. It's almost I don't know if it's a betrothal here or not, but there's a borderline adultery going on here because she's promised another man, and it's his own son.
Yeah.
Yes, he said she's more righteous than me because I didn't give my I didn't keep.
Yeah, absolutely. And if he had kept that promise, well, it wouldn't have been with Tamar that any of this stuff happened anyway. So absolutely, yeah. And that's such an important thing too, just as we're reading through biblical narratives, to see what upsets them compared to what upsets us. That's such a great point too.
You still know that's wrong, but maybe keeping your word, and you know, he kind of does that maybe, but for him, he doesn't seem to be as nearly as upset about his sexual misdeeds as he is about the fact that he made a promise and he didn't keep it. That's really where he seems to feel that he failed here. He made a commitment, but he was lying. He just was trying to keep her in the house, in the family, you know, just kind of string her along. And when he realizes that he has not kept his word, that's when he says, you know what? I didn't keep my word, and that makes me worse than a temple prostitute.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh man, where's the time gone? That's such a great point too, because if we're thinking about the overarching theme of the scheme of redemption throughout the whole Bible, here is Judah who hasn't kept his promise, and he realizes that that's a big deal. And here's God who has repeated the same promise to multiple people and saying, this is what I am going to do. This is going to happen. And we're going to see, and we do see that he doesn't break that. Even though these imperfect people are doing this stuff. I mean, it's icky to talk about. I mean, it's weird. It's weird. But even in that, God is true. His promises, you can take them to the bank. I don't even know what that phrase means, to be honest with you. But you can take it to the bank because it's sure. It is. It's sure. Okay, any other thoughts so far? We're running out of time. That's okay. I was actually hoping to finish Genesis, but then I get excited and I just keep talking about stuff. Okay, so in Genesis 42, I'm sort of skipping over Joseph on purpose. I want you to know that. We're going to come back to Joseph sort of after this because the seed is going to go through Judah, not Joseph. The line needs to be preserved, and that happens through Joseph, but the line is actually delivered through the seed of Judah here. In Genesis 42, Jacob sends his sons to get grain from Egypt. We're in the famine years. It's horrible, and he doesn't want to send Benjamin, his youngest son, because he loves him more than the rest. He doesn't want to lose him like Joseph. He still thinks Joseph is dead at this point. Joseph recognizes the brothers. They don't recognize him. He accuses them of being spies. He ends up giving them grain, sending them on their journey and all their money back. But the famine is so bad that they have to go back and get more grain from Egypt. So they have to go again. And they're terrified because, okay, we got food, we got provisions, and our money was returned to us. So if we go back there again, we're probably going to get got. Like we're going to get killed because we didn't pay the first time and we don't want to go back. But the famine's so bad that they don't have another option. That's the only place that has grain. So they've got to go back up to Egypt. And in Genesis 43, Judah speaks up and he says, like, we have to bring Benjamin. He said, don't come back unless you bring the youngest son. And Jacob still doesn't like the idea. But in Genesis 43, let's start at verse 3. Verse 3. Judah spoke to him, however, saying, the man solemnly warned us, talking about Joseph, you shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. If you send our brother with us, we will go down and buy you food. But if you do not send him, we will not go down. For the man said to us, you will not see my face unless your brother is with you. Then Israel said, why did you treat me so badly by telling the man whether you still had another brother? But they said, the man questioned particularly about us and about our relatives, saying, is your father still alive? Have you another brother? So we answered his questions. Could we possibly know that he would say, bring your brother down? By the way, I love this interaction because this is just parents and son talking like, why'd you even tell him you had another brother? He's like, he was asking us really specific questions. What were we supposed to do? We didn't know he was going to say, bring your brother. I love that interaction. Okay, let's keep reading here. Verse 8, Judah said to his father Israel, send the lad with me and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, we as well as you and our little ones. Verse 9 is so important because think about Judah and what we've seen about Judah so far. Look at verse 9. I myself will be surety for him, and you may hold me responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame before you forever. For if we had not delayed, surely by now we could have returned twice. Okay, I mean, when we read verse 9, If I didn't even tell you that this was Judah who said this, who might you assume this would be? In verse 9. Maybe I'm the only one. If I just saw this and somebody was like, this is a Bible verse, I'd be like, Jesus said that. I mean, surely Jesus said that, right? I mean, look at verse 9 again. I myself will be surety for him. You may hold me responsible for him. If I don't bring him back to you and set him before you, let me bear the blame before you forever. I don't know about you all, but that sounds a whole lot like the one who bore our iniquities, the one who bears our sorrows, the man of sorrows who did all of it. That's what it makes me think of. And this is Judah, the same guy who just a few chapters earlier was sleeping with temple prostitutes, was not giving his son to the woman that he promised. And this is Judah. I mean, we see a progression. It looks like some changes from Judah. He realizes this woman was more righteous than I in this, and seems like he's making some changes. So much so that this is his attitude in this situation. And I think we'll talk about that more maybe next week. Any thoughts before we keep going or not keep going, depending on the bell? Let's go. Perfect timing. All right, next week we'll finish up with Judah. Hopefully we'll finish Genesis.